This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. Christmas 1987 in New York City was meant to be a season of joy and wonder. The streets of Manhattan sparkled with holiday lights, department store windows displayed magical winter scenes, and the spirit of giving filled the crisp December air. But beneath the festive veneer, the pressures of the holiday season, financial strain, family expectations, and the relentless pursuit of the perfect Christmas weighed heavily on many families. In the borough of Queens, the Castellano family appeared to embody the American dream. Frank Castellano, a construction foreman, and his wife Margaret, a part-time seamstress, had built what seemed like a stable life with their 3 children in a modest 2-story home. But the economic uncertainties of the late 1980s, combined with the mounting pressure to provide an unforgettable Christmas experience, had begun to fray the edges of their carefully maintained facade. What started as a simple family outing to see the Christmas displays would spiral into one of the most bizarre incidents in New York holiday history. This is the story of how perceived slights, wounded pride, and the distortion of holiday justice led an ordinary family down a path that would shock their community and forever change their lives. The events that unfolded over 5 days in December 1987 serve as a cautionary tale about the thin line between righteous indignation and dangerous obsession, set against the backdrop of America's most celebrated holiday season. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The Castellano house on 47th Avenue in Elmhurst, Queens, stood like a beacon of Christmas spirit in the gray December morning of 1987. Red and green lights outlined every window. An inflatable Santa dominated the small front yard, and the scent of Margaret's cinnamon cookies drifted through the crisp air. Inside, the living room buzzed with the controlled chaos of a family preparing for what Frank Castellano had declared would be the best damn Christmas these kids ever had. Frank stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching his breath fog the glass as he surveyed his domain. At 42, he still carried himself with the broad-shouldered confidence of a man who built things with his hands, though the worry lines around his eyes had deepened over the past year. Construction work had been sporadic, and Margaret's part-time income from alterations barely covered the mounting bills. But Christmas was sacred in the Castellano household, and Frank would be damned if his children would suffer because of his financial struggles. "Frankie, you're going to be late for work," Margaret called from the stove, her voice carrying the slight rasp of a woman who'd smoked too many cigarettes during anxious nights. She flipped pancakes with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and precise. At 39, she retained the sharp beauty of her younger years, though her dark hair now showed threads of premature gray she'd stopped bothering to cover. Their 3 children sat around the small Formica table, each lost in their own pre-Christmas excitement. Tommy, 14, picked at his breakfast while sketching what looked like a skateboard ramp in his notebook margins. Lisa, 11, methodically cut her pancakes into perfect squares, her serious brown eyes already calculating the days until Christmas morning. 7-year-old Michael bounced in his chair, syrup on his chin, chattering about Santa Claus and reindeer with the infectious enthusiasm only possible at his age. "Dad, you promised we could go see the big Santa at Macy's today," Michael announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute faith in parental promises. "And the one at the Plaza Hotel, and the one at Rockefeller Center, and—" "Easy there, Tiger," Frank laughed, ruffling his youngest son's hair. "We're going to see every Santa in Manhattan if that's what makes you happy. Your old man's got the whole day planned out." He'd taken a rare Saturday off, something that would normally send him into fits of anxiety about lost wages, but the gleam in Michael's eyes made it worthwhile. Margaret shot him a look over the stove. They'd discussed this. The subway fare alone for 5 people would eat into their grocery money for the week. But Frank had that stubborn set to his jaw that she recognized, the one that meant he'd made up his mind about something and wouldn't be swayed by practical concerns. "The Hendersons next door are taking their kids too," Lisa chimed in, her voice carrying a hint of competition. Katie said they're going to see 12 different Santas and get pictures with all of them. Frank's coffee mug hit the counter with more force than necessary. The Hendersons. Jim Henderson worked in middle management at some corporate office in Manhattan, drove a new Buick, and never missed an opportunity to mention his family's latest acquisition or adventure. Frank had watched through the kitchen window as Jim loaded expensive wrapped packages into his trunk the night before, each one bearing the distinctive ribbon of high-end department stores. "Well, the Henderson kids are going to have to settle for 12, Frank said, his voice taking on the slightly manic edge that Margaret had learned to recognize. "Because the Castellano kids are going to see 15 Santas, and they're going to remember this Christmas for the rest of their lives." Tommy looked up from his notebook with the skeptical expression of a teenager who'd begun to see through his father's grand pronouncements. "Dad, there aren't 15 Santas in Manhattan." "Shows what you know, smart guy," Frank shot back, but without real anger. "Your mother and we've been doing research. Every department store, every hotel lobby, every street corner. We're going to hit 'em all. This is going to be a Christmas adventure like no other family in Queens has ever had." Margaret watched her husband with a mixture of love and concern. She recognized this mood, the desperate optimism that seized Frank whenever he felt like he was falling behind, like he wasn't providing enough for his family. It was the same energy that had led him to take on dangerous overtime shifts, to promise elaborate birthday parties they couldn't afford, to insist on maintaining traditions even when common sense suggested otherwise. After Frank left for work, a half-day shift at a construction site in Brooklyn, Margaret sat with her children and tried to manage expectations without dampening their excitement. "Now listen, you three," she said, clearing the breakfast dishes with efficient movements. "Today's going to be special, but I want you to remember that Christmas isn't about how many Santas we see or how many pictures we take. It's about family and being grateful for what we have." "But Dad said we're going to see 15, Michael protested, his lower lip threatening to tremble at any suggestion that his father's promise might not be absolute. "And we're going to try our best to do that," Margaret assured him, though privately she wondered how they'd managed to afford lunch for 5 people during a day-long excursion through Manhattan's most expensive neighborhoods. "But the most important thing is that we're all together." That afternoon, as the family gathered for their grand adventure, Frank's energy was infectious. He'd mapped out their route with military precision, starting with the department stores on the Upper East Side, working their way down to Midtown, and finishing with the street corner Santas in Times Square and around Central Park. Each child carried a small camera loaded with film that had cost Frank his lunch money for the week, and Margaret had packed a thermos of hot chocolate and sandwiches to stretch their budget. The subway ride into Manhattan felt like the beginning of an epic journey. Michael pressed his face to the window, watching the familiar Queens neighborhoods give way to the towering skyline of the city. Lisa studied the route map with the intensity of a military strategist, while Tommy affected teenage disinterest even as his eyes lit up at the prospect of adventure. Their first stop was Bloomingdale's, where a professional Santa held court in an elaborate winter wonderland, complete with artificial snow and animatronic reindeer. The line stretched around the toy department, filled with well-dressed families speaking in the confident tones of people for whom an expensive day of Christmas shopping was routine rather than sacrifice. Frank surveyed the scene with the calculating gaze of a general planning a campaign. The other families had the casual ease of people accustomed to luxury, children in designer winter coats, parents consulting expensive watches and discussing dinner reservations at restaurants Frank had only heard about. But his kids were just as deserving of magic, just as worthy of Christmas memories. "Okay, Team Castellano," he announced, his voice carrying the forced cheer he used when he was trying to convince himself as much as his children. "First Santa of the day. Let's make this one count." As they waited in line, Frank found himself studying the other families, cataloguing their differences and similarities. The children's excitement was universal. That bright-eyed anticipation transcended economic boundaries. But the parents' conversations revealed a world of casual wealth that felt like a foreign country. Ski trips to Vermont, private schools, summer houses in the Hamptons. A life that existed on the other side of an invisible but impermeable barrier. When their turn finally came, Frank watched his children's faces transform with wonder as they approached the elaborate Santa setup. Michael's shyness evaporated as the professional Santa, clearly experienced with children, drew him into conversation about reindeer and toy-making. Lisa maintained her serious demeanor, but couldn't hide her smile as Santa guessed her favorite subject in school. Even Tommy, despite his teenage sophistication, found himself charmed by the man's genuine warmth and attention. The photographer captured the moment. All three children clustered around Santa, their faces glowing with pure Christmas joy. Frank felt a surge of pride and satisfaction that temporarily pushed aside his financial worries. This was what it was all about, these moments of perfect happiness that would become cherished memories. But as they prepared to leave for their next destination, Frank noticed something that made his stomach tighten with inexplicable irritation. A group of 7 children from what appeared to be an extended family, grandparents, parents, aunts, and uncles, approached the Santa setup with the easy confidence of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. They were clearly wealthy, their clothes expensive and their manner entitled. Frank watched as they bypassed the line with the casual arrogance of people who believed rules were suggestions rather than requirements. One of the adults spoke quietly to a store employee. A folded bill changed hands and suddenly, the group was being ushered directly to Santa without waiting. "Excuse me," Frank called out, his voice carrying across the crowded toy department. "There's a line here. We've all been waiting." The adults in the wealthy family glanced at him with the kind of dismissive look usually reserved for street vendors or panhandlers. One of the men, dressed in a cashmere coat that probably cost more than Frank made in a month, shrugged with elaborate indifference. "Private session," the man said simply, as if that explained everything. Frank felt heat rising in his chest, but Margaret's hand on his arm reminded him that his children were watching. He bit back the angry words that wanted to spill out, but the moment felt like a small defeat, a reminder of his place in the city's rigid hierarchy. As they rode the subway to their next destination, Frank found himself replaying the incident, each repetition adding new layers of indignation. It wasn't about the money, he told himself. It was about fairness, about respect, about the idea that Christmas magic should be available to everyone equally. Margaret watched her husband's face and recognized the warning signs, the tight set of his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. She'd seen this before, usually when Frank felt like someone had questioned his ability to provide for his family or challenged his dignity as a working man. "It's okay, honey," she said quietly. "The kids had a great time. That's what matters." But Frank's smile felt forced as they emerged from the subway at their next stop. The perfect Christmas adventure was continuing, but something had shifted in his mood, a small crack in his holiday optimism that would widen as the day progressed. The second Santa, at a small boutique hotel on the Upper East Side, greeted them warmly and spent genuine time with each child. Frank's spirits lifted again as Michael peppered Santa with questions about the North Pole, and Lisa asked about the logistics of global toy distribution. But as they prepared for their third stop, Frank found himself studying every interaction, watching for signs of disrespect or dismissal. The day stretched ahead of them, full of promise and potential disappointment, as Frank Castellanos' quest for the perfect Christmas began to take on the intensity of a personal mission that would soon spiral far beyond anything his family could have imagined. By late afternoon, the Castellano family had visited 8 different Santas across Manhattan, and Frank's meticulously planned Christmas adventure was beginning to show signs of strain. What had started as a joyful family outing was gradually transforming into something more intense, driven by Frank's growing obsession with documenting every moment of his children's happiness, while simultaneously cataloguing every perceived slight or injustice they encountered. The third Santa at Saks Fifth Avenue had been perfectly pleasant, posing patiently for pictures while engaging Tommy in a surprisingly sophisticated conversation about basketball statistics. The fourth, stationed outside the Plaza Hotel, had charmed Lisa with his knowledge of different Christmas traditions around the world. But by the time they reached their 5th stop, a department store in Midtown where a weary-looking Santa was nearing the end of his shift, Frank's hypervigilance was beginning to manifest in ways that made Margaret increasingly uncomfortable. "Excuse me," Frank had said to the store manager after their Plaza Hotel visit, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled frustration. "Your Santa there just completely ignored those 7 kids. They walked right up to him, polite as anything, and he acted like they weren't even there. Margaret frowned, trying to recall the incident Frank was referring to. She remembered a group of children approaching the Santa setup, but she'd been distracted by Michael's excitement about the hotel's elaborate decorations. The Santa had seemed tired but professional, and she hadn't noticed any particular rudeness. "I'm sorry, sir," the manager had replied with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to handling holiday complaints. "Can you describe exactly what happened?" Frank's account of the incident seemed to grow in the telling. What Margaret vaguely remembered as a brief interaction where the Santa had been changing shifts became, in Frank's version, a deliberate snub of 7 well-behaved children who had approached with appropriate Christmas enthusiasm, only to be coldly dismissed by an unfeeling performer who had forgotten the true meaning of the holiday. "These weren't just any kids," Frank continued, his voice rising slightly. "They were good kids, respectful kids, the kind of children who believe in Christmas magic. And your Santa just looked right through them like they didn't matter." The manager promised to speak with the employee, but Frank wasn't satisfied. As they walked away, he continued to rehash the incident, each retelling adding new details that Margaret wasn't sure she remembered. "Did you see the way he looked at them?" Frank asked Tommy, who had been more interested in the hotel's doormen than the Santa interaction. "Just completely dismissed them, like they weren't worth his time." Tommy shrugged with the casual indifference of a 14-year-old who was beginning to suspect his father was overreacting to something he hadn't really noticed. But Michael, ever eager to please his father and share in adult concerns, nodded solemnly. "I was mean to those kids, Dad," Michael agreed, though his recollection of events seemed more influenced by Frank's passionate retelling than by actual memory. "They just wanted to say hi to Santa." Lisa, characteristically analytical, remained silent, but Margaret could see her daughter processing the situation with the uncomfortable awareness that something about their family dynamic was shifting in ways she didn't fully understand. Their 6th stop was a small specialty store in the theater district, where a young man in an ill-fitting Santa costume was clearly struggling with his first holiday season performance job. His beard was askew, his energy was low, and he seemed more focused on watching the clock than engaging with visiting children. When the Castellano family approached, he managed a tired smile and posed dutifully for pictures, but his interaction with the children felt perfunctory and distracted. "Ho, ho, ho," he said with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. "What do you want for Christmas?" Michael, still energized by their day of Santa visits, launched into an elaborate description of his wish list, but the young man's attention seemed to wander. He nodded occasionally and made appropriate sounds, but his eyes kept drifting to other customers, to his supervisor, to the clock on the wall. Frank watched this interaction with mounting frustration. After the perceived slight at the Plaza Hotel, this Santa's obvious disengagement felt like a personal insult. These were his children, good children who deserved better than a half-hearted performance from someone who clearly didn't understand the responsibility of wearing the red suit. "That's nice, kid," the Santa said when Michael finished his wish list recitation, already turning his attention to the next family in line. "Hope Santa can bring you everything." The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. Frank felt his jaw clench as they walked away, the familiar heat of indignation rising in his chest. This wasn't about money or class or economic advantage. This was about basic respect, about recognizing the importance of childhood wonder and treating it with appropriate reverence. "That guy didn't even listen to what Michael said," Frank muttered to Margaret as they walked down the crowded sidewalk. "Just brushed him off like he was nothing." Margaret, who had been growing increasingly concerned about Frank's escalating reactions, tried to diffuse the situation. "Honey, it's late in the day. The poor kid's probably been working since morning. Michael doesn't seem upset." But Frank wasn't ready to let it go. "It's not about being tired, Maggie. It's about doing your job right. When you put on that Santa suit, you've got a responsibility to those kids. You don't get to just phone it in." Their 7th Santa, positioned outside a busy department store, was clearly dealing with the overwhelming chaos of holiday shopping season. A long line of families waited in the cold December air, children bundled in winter coats and parents checking watches with increasing impatience. When the Castellano family finally reached the front of the line, The Santa was in the middle of dealing with a difficult customer, a woman complaining loudly about the wait time and demanding special accommodations for her twin toddlers. In the confusion and stress of the moment, as the Santa tried to juggle customer service issues while maintaining his jolly persona, he failed to notice a group of 7 children who had been patiently waiting at the edge of his setup. The children, ranging in age from about 5 to 12, stood quietly with their parents, clearly hoping for a chance to speak with Santa once the current crisis was resolved. But as the afternoon wore on and the Santa became increasingly frazzled by demanding customers and management pressures, the 7 children were repeatedly overlooked. Each time they tried to approach, another family would cut in front of them, or the Santa would be called away to handle some administrative issue, or their quiet politeness would be overshadowed by more aggressive parents pushing their own children forward. Frank watched this unfold with growing agitation. These children weren't the wealthy, entitled kids from earlier in the day who could buy their way to the front of lines. They appeared to be from working-class families like his own, parents who had probably saved money and planned carefully for this Christmas outing. Their quiet patience and good behavior made their repeated overlooking feel like a profound injustice. "This is ridiculous," Frank said to Margaret, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Those kids have been standing there for 20 minutes. That Santa's completely ignoring them." Margaret followed his gaze and saw the group of children he was referring to. They did seem to be having trouble getting the Santa's attention, but the situation appeared to be more about chaos and poor organization than deliberate slight. The harried Santa was clearly overwhelmed, trying to manage too many competing demands in an increasingly hectic environment. "Maybe we should go," Margaret suggested. "The kids are getting cold, and we still have more stops planned." But Frank was fixated on the injustice unfolding before him. He watched as the 7 children were passed over again and again, their faces showing increasing disappointment as other families received attention while they remained invisible at the margins of the Santa setup. "No," Frank said firmly, "this isn't right. Someone needs to say something." He approached the Santa during a brief lull in the chaos, his voice carrying the controlled intensity of a man trying very hard to remain reasonable in the face of what he perceived as inexcusable behavior. "Excuse me," Frank said, his words cutting through the ambient noise of street traffic and holiday shoppers. "Those 7 kids over there have been waiting patiently for over 20 minutes. They deserve some attention." The Santa, already stressed and defensive from dealing with complaints all afternoon, reacted poorly to what he perceived as yet another criticism of his performance. "Sir, I'm doing my best here. There are a lot of families waiting, and I can only handle one at a time." "Those kids aren't waiting," Frank pressed, his voice rising slightly. "They're being ignored. They're standing right there, being polite and patient, and you're acting like they don't exist." The Santa's supervisor, attracted by the raised voices, approached with the weary expression of someone accustomed to mediating holiday disputes. "Is there a problem here?" Frank found himself explaining the situation with increasing passion, his words coming faster and his gestures becoming more animated. In his telling, the 7 overlooked children became symbols of everything wrong with the commercialized, heartless version of Christmas that prioritized wealthy customers over genuine childhood wonder. "These kids believe in Santa," Frank said, his voice carrying across the busy sidewalk. "They've been standing there with perfect behavior, waiting for their turn, and your employee is completely disregarding them. This is supposed to be about magic and joy, not about who can push their way to the front of the line." Margaret watched her husband with growing alarm. She recognized this escalation pattern from other situations where Frank felt his family's dignity or worth was being questioned. What had started as a reasonable concern about overlooked children was becoming something more intense, more personal, more invested with meanings that seemed to go far beyond the immediate situation. The supervisor assured Frank that the children would receive attention, and indeed the Santa did subsequently engage with the group of 7, posing for pictures and listening to their Christmas wishes with appropriate enthusiasm. But for Frank, the damage was already done. The fact that intervention had been necessary, that these children's worth hadn't been immediately recognized and celebrated, felt like a symptom of a larger societal problem. As the Castellano family continued their Santa tour, visiting their 8th location at a small shop in Greenwich Village, Frank's commentary became increasingly focused on issues of fairness, respect, and the proper treatment of children during the holiday season. What had started as a fun family adventure was becoming a mission with higher stakes and deeper significance. "You see what's happening here, don't you?" Frank asked Margaret as they rode the subway to their next destination. "These Santas think they can just pick and choose which kids are worth their time. They see well-dressed families, and they turn on the charm. But regular kids, working-class kids, kids who might not have all the fancy clothes and expensive cameras, those kids get ignored." Margaret wanted to argue that Frank was reading too much into what were probably just random interactions and coincidences, but she could see that her husband was beyond the point where reasonable discussions about perspective and context would be welcome. He had identified a pattern of injustice, and every subsequent interaction would be viewed through that lens. The eighth Santa, an elderly gentleman volunteering at a community center, was actually wonderful with all the children who visited him. He spent extra time with kids who seemed shy or nervous. He remembered details from previous conversations with returning visitors, and he treated each child's Christmas wishes with genuine interest and respect. Frank should have been pleased by this positive experience, but instead he seemed almost disappointed that there was no injustice to identify and address. "Finally," he said as they left the community center, "someone who understands what wearing that suit actually means." But the praise felt backhanded, as if the elderly volunteer's kindness was notable primarily because it contrasted with the perceived failures of the other Santas they'd encountered. Frank was creating a narrative where most Christmas figures were failing in their basic responsibilities, and only exceptional individuals were meeting the standards that should be routine. As evening approached and the December air grew colder, the Castellano family faced a decision about whether to continue their quest. They had seen 8 Santas, taken dozens of photographs, and created what should have been a day's worth of wonderful Christmas memories. The children were tired but happy, having experienced more holiday magic in one afternoon than most kids encounter in an entire season. But Frank wasn't ready to call it a day. His original goal of 15 Santas had become something more than just an arbitrary number. It represented a commitment to his children's happiness and a rejection of any suggestion that the Castellano family should settle for less than the best Christmas experience possible. "We're not done yet," Frank announced as they emerged from the subway station near Times Square. "We've got 7 more Santas to visit, and we're going to see every single one of them." Margaret looked at her tired children and felt a growing sense of unease about the direction their family adventure was taking. What had started as a celebration of Christmas magic was becoming something more obsessive, more driven by Frank's need to prove something to himself and the world than by the children's actual desires for holiday fun. But as they walked through the neon-bright chaos of Times Square, heading toward their 9th Santa encounter of the day, Margaret couldn't have imagined how dramatically and dangerously Frank's quest for Christmas justice was about to escalate. The evening was just beginning, and Frank Castellano's growing fixation on perceived slights and overlooked children was about to encounter a series of situations that would push his indignation far beyond anything his family could have anticipated or controlled. Times Square on a December evening in 1987 was a sensory assault of neon lights, car horns, street vendors, and holiday tourists from around the world. The Castellano family emerged from the subway into this chaos, with Frank leading the charge toward their 9th Santa encounter, his determination intensified by the day's accumulating frustrations and his growing conviction that he was fighting for something larger than a simple family outing. The first Times Square Santa they encountered was positioned outside a souvenir shop, surrounded by the usual collection of street performers, tourists, and New Yorkers hurrying home from work. This Santa was clearly a professional street performer rather than a department store employee. His costume was more elaborate, his persona more theatrical, and his interaction style designed to extract tips from passing crowds rather than provide intimate one-on-one experiences with children. As the Castellano family approached, Frank immediately noticed the same group of 7 children from the earlier department store Santa encounter. They had apparently followed a similar route through Manhattan, visiting multiple Santa locations throughout the day. The children looked tired but still excited, their parents checking watches and discussing dinner plans, while maintaining the patient endurance of adults committed to seeing their holiday adventure through to completion. Frank watched as these 7 children approached the Times Square Santa with the same polite enthusiasm they had shown all day. But this Santa, focused on extracting tips from adult tourists and managing the chaotic street environment, barely acknowledged their presence. His attention was divided between posing for photographs with paying customers, bantering with street vendors, and keeping an eye on his collection of bills and coins. "Ho, ho, ho," the Santa called out in a booming voice designed to carry over street noise. "Pictures with Santa. Holiday magic for the whole family. Step right up." The 7 children moved forward hopefully, but the Santa's gaze passed right over them to focus on a group of well-dressed tourists who were pulling out expensive cameras and discussing photo opportunities. The children waited patiently at the edge of the performance space, their quiet politeness making them nearly invisible in the aggressive carnival atmosphere of Times Square. Frank felt his jaw clench as he watched the scene unfold. This was the 3rd time today that these particular 7 children had been overlooked or dismissed by Santa performers, and the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. These weren't isolated incidents or random coincidences. This was systematic neglect of children who deserved better. "Michael, Tommy, Lisa," Frank called to his own children, who were watching the Times Square Santa with fascination. "Come here for a minute." His children gathered around him, their faces glowing with excitement from their day of Christmas adventures. Frank knelt down to their level, his voice taking on the serious tone he used when he wanted to teach them important life lessons. "I want you to see what's happening here," Frank said, gesturing toward the 7 overlooked children. "Those kids over there, they've been polite and patient all day long. They've followed every rule, shown proper respect, and waited their turn like they were taught. But watch what happens when they try to talk to Santa." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. She recognized the intensity in Frank's voice, the way his hands gestured more emphatically when he was building towards some kind of confrontation. This wasn't just about Christmas magic anymore. Frank was turning their family outing into a teaching moment about injustice and moral courage. "Frank," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice calm and reasonable, "maybe we should just move on to the next Santa. The kids are getting cold and we still have dinner plans." But Frank wasn't listening. His attention was completely focused on the unfolding drama of the 7 overlooked children and what he perceived as the Santa's deliberate indifference to their presence. When one of the children finally worked up the courage to approach the Santa directly, tugging gently on his red coat to get attention, the performer's response sent Frank's indignation into overdrive. "Not now, kid," the Santa said without even looking down, his attention focused on counting the bills in his collection container. "Can't you see I'm busy here?" The child stepped back, clearly hurt and confused by the dismissal. The other 6 children gathered around their friend, their excited chatter dying into disappointed silence. Their parents exchanged glances that mixed embarrassment with anger, clearly debating whether to intervene or simply move on to avoid further humiliation. Frank Castellano made his decision in that moment. He stood up from his crouch beside his children and walked directly toward the Times Square Santa with the purposeful stride of a man who had reached the limit of his tolerance for injustice. "Excuse me," Frank said, his voice carrying over the street noise with unmistakable authority. "Those 7 children have been trying to get your attention for 10 minutes. They deserve some acknowledgement." The Santa looked up from his money counting with the irritated expression of a performer whose routine had been interrupted. "Look, buddy, I'm working here. These kids can wait their turn like everyone else." "They have been waiting their turn," Frank shot back, his voice rising. "They've been waiting patiently and politely while you ignored them for paying customers. These are children we're talking about. They believe in Christmas magic, and you're treating them like they don't matter." A small crowd began to gather around the confrontation, drawn by the raised voices and the unusual sight of an angry parent challenging a street performer. The 7 overlooked children watched with wide eyes as this stranger fought for their right to Santa's attention, while their parents seemed torn between gratitude and discomfort at having their family situation become a public spectacle. "Sir, I understand you're upset," the Santa said, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. "But I've got a business to run here. I can't spend unlimited time with every kid who walks by." A business? Frank's voice cracked with indignation. You're supposed to be Santa Claus. This isn't about business. It's about the magic of Christmas and treating children with the respect they deserve. Margaret approached her husband with growing alarm, the children trailing behind her uncertainly. She could see that Frank was beyond the point of rational discussion, his face flushed with anger, and his gestures becoming more animated with each exchange. "Frank, please," she said, placing a restraining hand on his arm. "Let's just go. This isn't our fight." But Frank shrugged off her touch, his attention completely focused on the Santa who had become the symbol of everything wrong with the commercialized, heartless version of Christmas that prioritized profit over childhood wonder. "It is our fight," Frank declared, his voice carrying to the growing crowd of onlookers. "Every time we let this kind of treatment slide, every time we accept that some children matter more than others, we're failing our responsibility as parents and as human beings." The Santa, clearly uncomfortable with the public confrontation and the attention it was drawing, tried to appease Frank by turning his attention to the 7 children. But his forced enthusiasm and obvious reluctance only made Frank angrier. "Now you want to be nice to them?" Frank said sarcastically. "Now that someone called you out on your behavior, suddenly you remember what that red suit is supposed to mean?" The situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. The 7 children, who had become unwilling symbols of Frank's crusade for Christmas justice, looked mortified by the attention their situation was receiving. Their parents were clearly debating whether to thank Frank for his intervention or ask him to stop making their children the center of a public scene. Street vendors and other performers in the area began to take notice of the commotion. Times Square in the 1980s was a place where confrontations could escalate quickly and unpredictably, and the growing crowd of onlookers included people with their own agendas and grievances who might see Frank's righteous anger as an opportunity to express their own frustrations. "You know what the problem is," Frank continued, his voice now addressing the crowd as much as the Santa. "We've forgotten what Christmas is supposed to be about. We've let money and convenience and commercial interests corrupt something that should be sacred. These children deserve better, and I'm not going to stand by and watch them be treated like second-class citizens." Margaret could see that her husband was moving beyond specific complaints about specific Santas into broader philosophical territory that would be much harder to resolve. This wasn't just about holiday etiquette anymore. Frank was taking a stand against what he perceived as fundamental injustices in society, using these 7 overlooked children as symbols of larger problems. "Sir, maybe we should call this a night," one of the parents of the 7 children said quietly, clearly hoping to diffuse the situation before it escalated further. "The kids have had a long day, and we don't want any trouble." But Frank interpreted this attempt at de-escalation as another example of the resigned acceptance that allowed injustice to flourish. "No," he said firmly. "That's exactly the attitude that lets this kind of treatment continue. We accept the unacceptable because we don't want to make waves and meanwhile children suffer." The Times Square Santa, thoroughly rattled by the confrontation and the attention it was drawing, tried to salvage the situation by offering free photo sessions to all the children involved, but his gestures felt hollow and forced, motivated more by damage control than genuine Christmas spirit. Frank wasn't satisfied with these token efforts. As the Castellano family finally moved away from the Times Square confrontation, he continued to process and replay the incident, his anger deepening with each retelling. "Did you see that?" he asked his children as they walked through the neon chaos toward their next destination. "Did you see how that Santa only cared about those kids after someone called him out? That's not real kindness. That's just covering his tracks." Tommy, Lisa, and Michael nodded uncertainly, clearly unsure how to respond to their father's intensity. They had wanted a fun day of Christmas magic, not a series of moral lessons about social justice and the corruption of holiday traditions. Their 10th Santa encounter at a large department store near Herald Square should have provided a neutral reset for the family's Christmas adventure. This Santa was professional, enthusiastic, and genuinely engaged with every child who visited him. He spent appropriate time with each family, asked thoughtful questions about Christmas wishes, and created the kind of magical experience that Frank had originally hoped to provide for his children. But instead of being pleased by this positive interaction, Frank seemed almost suspicious of the Santa's friendliness. He studied the man's every gesture and word choice, looking for signs of the favoritism and neglect he had identified as systemic problems in the Santa industry. "He's good," Frank admitted grudgingly as they left the department store. "But you notice he's making extra effort because he knows people are watching. These guys can turn on the charm when they want to. The question is whether they choose to do it for all children or just the ones they think matter." Margaret realized with growing dread that her husband was creating an impossible standard that would allow him to find fault with any Santa they encountered. If a Santa was kind to children, he was only performing for public approval. If a Santa was tired or distracted, he was deliberately neglecting his responsibilities. Frank had constructed a framework of interpretation that would generate outrage regardless of actual circumstances. Their 11th Santa, stationed outside a busy restaurant in Midtown, was dealing with the typical chaos of dinner-hour foot traffic and impatient customers. When the Castellano family approached, he was in the middle of managing a difficult situation involving a drunk customer who was harassing families and making inappropriate comments to children. In the confusion of this crisis, the Santa was forced to divide his attention between maintaining safety, calling for security assistance, and trying to preserve some semblance of holiday magic for the children who were waiting. During this chaotic period, another group of 7 children, different from the earlier group but similar in their quiet politeness and patient demeanor, found themselves overlooked as the Santa dealt with more pressing security concerns. Frank watched this unfold with the grim satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions were being confirmed. Here was yet another Santa who was failing to prioritize children's Christmas experiences. Another example of the systematic neglect that was corrupting the holiday season. "This is unbelievable," Frank muttered to Margaret as they watched the Santa struggle with crowd control issues. "Every single Santa we encounter has the same problem. They can't be bothered to pay attention to children who actually deserve their time." Margaret tried to point out that the Santa was dealing with a legitimate safety crisis and couldn't reasonably be expected to conduct normal operations under these circumstances. But Frank was beyond the point where reasonable explanations would be accepted. He had identified a pattern of injustice, and every new incident was simply further evidence of the conspiracy he was uncovering. "Those 7 kids are getting completely ignored," Frank said, his voice taking on the same intensity that had characterized his Times Square confrontation. "Again, it's the same thing over and over. Polite, well-behaved children being treated like they don't exist." The security situation resolved itself relatively quickly, and the Santa did subsequently engage with the 7 overlooked children, providing them with the same warm attention he offered to every family. But the brief delay during the crisis management had been enough to trigger Frank's indignation and add another incident to his growing list of grievances against the Santa industry. As the evening progressed and the Castellano family continued their tour, Frank's commentary became increasingly conspiratorial. He began to see connections between incidents that were probably unrelated, patterns of discrimination that existed primarily in his own interpretation of events, and evidence of organized disrespect for children from working-class families. "You know what's happening here?" Frank asked Margaret as they rode the subway toward their 12th Santa location. "This isn't random. These Santas are getting some kind of message about which kids to prioritize and which kids to ignore. They're being told to focus on wealthy families and blow off regular families like us." Margaret felt a chill of genuine fear as she listened to her husband articulate increasingly elaborate theories about Santa-based conspiracies. This was no longer about Christmas magic or family fun. Frank was constructing a worldview in which his family and people like them were under systematic attack by forces that wanted to deny their children access to holiday joy. The 12th Santa encounter at a small shop in the village proceeded without incident. The Santa was friendly and professional, the children had a positive experience, and no particular groups were overlooked or neglected. But Frank's satisfaction with this interaction was overshadowed by his conviction that the previous problems were evidence of a larger pattern that demanded action. "See, he can do it when he wants to," Frank said as they left the shop. "These guys know how to treat children right. They just choose not to do it most of the time." By the time they reached their 13th Santa location, a street performer near Washington Square Park, it was nearly 9 o'clock in the evening. The children were exhausted. Margaret was increasingly anxious about Frank's escalating mood, and the magical Christmas adventure had transformed into something much darker and more obsessive. This Santa, like the Times Square performer, was focused primarily on adult tourists and tip generation, rather than intimate child interactions. When yet another group of 7 children, the third such group they had encountered throughout the day, approached with the same patient politeness that Frank had come to see as a marker of authentic Christmas spirit, the Santa's distracted response triggered the most intense confrontation yet. "Excuse me," Frank said, approaching the Santa with the confident stride of someone who had appointed himself as a defender of children's rights. "Those 7 children have been trying to get your attention for 15 minutes. This is completely unacceptable." But this Santa, unlike the previous performers, was not inclined to accept Frank's criticism quietly. "Look, pal, I don't know what your problem is, but I'm doing my job here. If you don't like how I run my operation, you can find another Santa." The dismissive response sent Frank's anger to a new level. This wasn't just neglect anymore. It was open defiance of his reasonable requests for basic respect toward children. The Santa's attitude represented everything Frank had come to hate about the commercialized, profit-driven version of Christmas that had replaced genuine holiday magic. "Your job?" Frank's voice rose to near shouting level. "Your job is to bring joy to children. Your job is to represent the spirit of Christmas. Your job is to treat every child like they matter." A crowd gathered quickly around this latest confrontation, drawn by the escalating voices and the unusual sight of a family man in full confrontation mode with a street performer. Margaret tried to pull Frank away from the situation, but he was completely focused on what had become, in his mind, a crucial battle for the soul of Christmas. "These 7 children deserve respect," Frank continued, his gestures becoming more animated and his voice carrying across the park. "They deserve attention. They deserve to be treated like their Christmas wishes matter just as much as anyone else's." The Santa, clearly uncomfortable with the public scene but unwilling to back down from what he perceived as an unreasonable attack on his professional competence, responded with equal intensity. "Nobody's being disrespected here except me. I'm trying to do my job and you're making a scene over nothing." It was at this moment that Frank Castellano crossed a line from which there would be no return. The combination of accumulated frustrations, perceived injustices, and his growing conviction that he was fighting for something larger than individual incidents combined to create a moment of decision that would change everything for his family. "Nothing?" Frank's voice cracked with incredulous anger. "You call the systematic neglect of children nothing? You call the deliberate dismissal of kids who believe in Christmas magic nothing?" Margaret watched in horror as her husband's anger reached a boiling point that she had never seen before. This wasn't just about Santa encounters anymore. Frank was having some kind of breakdown, triggered by the accumulation of perceived slights and his growing obsession with defending children who may not have needed or wanted his protection. "Frank, we need to go," Margaret said urgently, grabbing his arm with enough force to get his attention. "The children are scared. This needs to stop." But when Frank looked at his wife and children, he saw not fear but the same kind of systematic dismissal he had been fighting all day. Even his own family was trying to silence him, trying to prevent him from standing up for what was right, trying to make him accept the unacceptable. "No," Frank said with quiet intensity, that was somehow more frightening than his earlier shouting. "This doesn't stop. This doesn't get swept under the rug. These children deserve justice, and someone needs to make sure they get it." As the crowd around the Washington Square confrontation grew larger and more volatile, as police sirens began to wail in the distance, and as Frank Castellano's quest for Christmas justice spiraled completely beyond anyone's control, none of the witnesses could have predicted how dramatically and dangerously the situation was about to escalate. The evening was far from over, and Frank's growing conviction that he was fighting a righteous battle against systematic injustice was about to drive him toward actions that would shock the entire city and destroy everything his family had worked to build. The line between justified outrage and dangerous obsession had been crossed, and there would be no going back to the innocent Christmas adventure that had started 12 hours earlier with such hope and excitement. The night of December 19, 1987 would forever be remembered in New York City police records as the Santa incident, though the full scope of what Frank Castellano had planned wouldn't become clear until investigators pieced together the events of the following 48 hours. What began as a family Christmas outing had transformed into something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated campaign of what Frank would later describe to psychiatrists as Christmas justice enforcement. After the confrontation at Washington Square Park, Margaret had managed to extract her family from the crowd of onlookers and concerned citizens who were beginning to debate whether Frank's passionate defense of overlooked children was admirable civic engagement or concerning public behavior. But as they rode the subway back to Queens, Frank's silence was more ominous than his earlier outbursts had been. He stared out the darkened windows with the fixed intensity of someone who had moved beyond anger into a realm of cold, calculating purpose. "Dad, are we still going to see the other Santas tomorrow?" Michael asked tentatively, his 7-year-old voice reflecting the confusion and exhaustion of a child who had witnessed his father's transformation from playful Christmas guide to something much more intense and frightening. "We're going to see all of them," Frank replied without looking away from the window. "Every single Santa in this city is going to learn what it means to respect children properly." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. There was something in Frank's tone that suggested his plans had evolved beyond simple Christmas visits into something more systematic and potentially dangerous. She tried to catch his eye, to break through the wall of obsessive focus that seemed to have settled around him, but Frank was clearly operating in a mental space that excluded input from family members who didn't share his growing conviction about the necessity of dramatic action. When they arrived home to their house on 47th Avenue, Frank immediately disappeared into the basement, claiming he needed to plan tomorrow's route more carefully. Margaret put the children to bed, fielding their confused questions about their father's behavior, with reassurances she didn't feel and explanations she couldn't provide. The magical Christmas adventure they had anticipated had become something else entirely, and she wasn't sure how to restore the sense of safety and normalcy her children desperately needed. It was nearly midnight when Frank finally emerged from the basement, carrying a manila folder filled with what appeared to be detailed notes and maps. He had spent hours documenting every Santa encounter from their day, recording names, locations, descriptions, and what he categorized as performance deficiencies in a handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. "I've identified the pattern," Frank announced to Margaret, who was waiting for him in the kitchen with the kind of forced calm she had learned to maintain during his periods of intense focus. "It's not random neglect, it's systematic discrimination. These Santa operations are deliberately designed to prioritize wealthy families while marginalizing working-class children." Margaret studied the papers Frank spread across their kitchen table. Page after page of detailed observations, sketched maps of Santa locations, and what appeared to be surveillance notes about the performers' schedules and habits. This wasn't the casual documentation of a family Christmas outing. This was the methodical planning of someone preparing for a much larger operation. "Frank, what exactly are you planning to do with all this information?" Margaret asked, though she was increasingly afraid she already knew the answer. "Justice," Frank replied simply, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had moved beyond doubt or debate. "These Santas have forgotten what their responsibility means. They need to be reminded, in a way they'll never forget, about the sacred trust they've violated." The next morning, December 20th, Frank called in sick to his construction job, something he had never done during the peak holiday season when overtime pay could make the difference between a sparse Christmas and a memorable one. Instead, he spent the day conducting what he called reconnaissance operations, visiting Santa locations throughout Manhattan to document schedules, security arrangements, and what he had begun to refer to as enforcement opportunities. Margaret tried to convince him to abandon whatever he was planning, to return to work, to focus on their own children's Christmas preparations rather than conducting a citywide campaign for Santa accountability. But Frank's responses had taken on the detached quality of someone who was operating according to an internal logic that didn't require external validation or approval. "You don't understand the scope of what we're dealing with," Frank explained to his wife that evening, his basement planning session having expanded to include detailed timelines and what appeared to be supply lists. "This isn't about individual bad experiences. This is about systematic oppression of children from families like ours. Someone needs to take a stand." On December 21st, Frank's plan moved from preparation to implementation. He had identified 5 specific Santa performers, who in his detailed analysis represented the worst examples of the discrimination and neglect he had documented. These weren't random targets. They were carefully selected symbols of what he saw as a corrupt system that needed dramatic correction. The first Santa, the street performer from Times Square, who had initially dismissed the 7 children, was scheduled to work a double shift to handle pre-Christmas crowds. Frank positioned himself across the street with a notebook and camera, documenting every interaction and building what he called evidence files that would justify the actions he was preparing to take. When Frank observed what he interpreted as yet another incident of child neglect, a busy moment when the Santa was focused on crowd control rather than individual attention, he decided the time had come for direct intervention. But this intervention would be unlike anything New York City had seen during its long history of holiday season disputes and confrontations. Frank approached the Santa's performance area during a brief lull in foot traffic, when the performer was taking a break, and the usual crowd of tourists and families had temporarily dispersed. What happened next would be reconstructed later from witness statements, security camera footage, and Frank's own detailed confessions to police psychiatrists. "You're coming with me," Frank said simply, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had moved beyond negotiation or debate. "You're going to learn what it really means to care about children's Christmas experiences." The Santa, recognizing Frank from previous confrontations, initially assumed this was another verbal altercation about customer service standards. But when Frank produced what appeared to be official-looking documentation and spoke with the confident authority of someone conducting legitimate business, the performer's resistance began to weaken. Frank had spent hours creating fake credentials that identified him as a representative of something he called the Christmas Standards Enforcement Division, complete with official-looking badges and documentation that would pass casual inspection. His years in construction had taught him about official procedures, proper protocols, and the kind of authoritative presentation that could convince people to comply with instructions they might otherwise question. "There have been multiple complaints about your performance standards," Frank explained, in the tone of a bureaucrat conducting routine business. "You're required to report for immediate retraining and performance review." The combination of Frank's official presentation, his detailed knowledge of specific incidents, and his calm confidence convinced the Times Square Santa to comply with what he believed was a legitimate regulatory intervention. When Frank led him to a rented van parked nearby, the performer assumed he was being transported to some kind of official hearing or training facility. It wasn't until they arrived at a warehouse space Frank had rented in Queens, paid for with money he had borrowed against their house without Margaret's knowledge, that the Santa realized the true nature of his situation. The space had been converted into what Frank called a Christmas rehabilitation center, complete with educational materials, performance evaluation criteria, and detailed documentation of proper Santa behavior standards. "You're going to stay here until you understand what you did wrong," Frank explained with the patient tone of a teacher addressing a difficult student. "You're going to study proper child interaction techniques, memorize appropriate Christmas responses, and demonstrate that you can treat all children with equal respect and attention." The kidnapped Santa found himself in a surreal situation that seemed to exist somewhere between legitimate educational intervention and inexplicable captivity. Frank provided food, comfortable accommodations, and endless lectures about Christmas responsibility, but made it clear that leaving wasn't an option until the retraining process was complete. Over the next 3 days, Frank systematically acquired 4 more Santa performers, using variations of the same technique. Each kidnapping was carefully planned and executed with the methodical precision of someone who believed he was conducting legitimate law enforcement operations rather than committing serious felonies. The second Santa from the Herald Square department store was convinced to leave his post during a shift break for what Frank described as an emergency consultation about customer service complaints. The third, a freelance performer working parties and events, was approached with fake documentation about licensing violations that required immediate resolution. The fourth and fifth Santas were acquired during what Frank presented as random quality control inspections conducted by his fictional Christmas Standards Enforcement Division. Each of the 5 kidnapped Santas found themselves in the Queen's warehouse space, which Frank had equipped with sleeping arrangements, bathroom facilities, and an extensive curriculum of Christmas education materials. He wasn't torturing them or demanding ransom. He was conducting what he genuinely believed to be necessary remedial education about proper Santa performance standards. "You're here because you failed in your most basic responsibility," Frank explained to his captives during their daily group sessions. "Children came to you with pure Christmas faith, and you dismissed them, ignored them, treated them like they didn't matter. That's not just poor customer service. That's a betrayal of everything Christmas is supposed to represent." The kidnapped Santas found themselves in the bizarre position of being held captive by someone who seemed genuinely convinced that he was helping them become better people. Frank's lectures were passionate and detailed, his educational materials were professionally prepared, and his conviction about the righteousness of his mission was absolute. Meanwhile, Margaret had been growing increasingly frantic about her husband's behavior and mysterious absences. When she discovered the warehouse rental receipts and borrowed money documentation, she realized that Frank's Christmas justice campaign had evolved into something far more serious and dangerous than she had imagined. "Frank, you have to stop this," she pleaded when she finally confronted him about the kidnappings. "This isn't justice. This is insane. You're going to destroy our family." But Frank's response revealed how completely he had separated himself from normal concepts of legality, morality, and family responsibility. "Our family," he said, with the calm certainty of someone who had achieved perfect clarity about his purpose. "What about all the other families whose children are being systematically neglected and dismissed? What about their Christmas dreams being crushed by people who've forgotten what the red suit means?" Margaret realized with growing horror that her husband was beyond the reach of rational argument or family obligation. He had constructed a moral framework that justified any action in service of what he saw as a righteous cause, and no amount of pleading about consequences or family welfare would penetrate his obsessive focus. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the warehouse Christmas Rehabilitation Center was discovered by police who had been conducting an increasingly intensive search for the missing Santa performers. The investigation had been complicated by Frank's careful planning and official-seeming documentation, which had initially led authorities to investigate legitimate regulatory agencies and training programs, rather than considering kidnapping as a possibility. When police finally breached the warehouse, they found a scene that defied easy categorization. The 5 kidnapped Santas were physically unharmed, but psychologically traumatized by their days of forced education about Christmas responsibility. Frank was in the middle of conducting what he called a final examination to determine whether his students had sufficiently internalized proper child interaction standards. "Officers, thank God you're here," Frank said with obvious relief when police entered the facility. "These Santa performers have completed their remedial training, and I believe they're ready to return to public service with improved understanding of their responsibilities to children." The surreal nature of Frank's presentation, his genuine belief that he had been conducting legitimate educational services rather than committing multiple felonies, initially confused responding officers who had expected to find either a ransom situation or evidence of more conventional criminal activity. It took several hours of investigation and interviews before police could piece together the full scope of what Frank had orchestrated. The kidnapped Santas provided detailed accounts of their captivity, describing days of forced attendance at lectures about Christmas spirit, mandatory participation in role-playing exercises designed to improve child interaction skills, and endless discussions about the moral obligations of holiday performers. "He really believed he was helping us," one of the kidnapped Santas told investigators. "He wasn't violent or threatening. He was just completely convinced that we needed this education and that he had the authority to provide it. It was like being held captive by someone who thought he was running a very intense customer service training program. Frank's arrest on Christmas Eve became front-page news in New York newspapers, though reporters struggled to find appropriate categories for describing his actions. The headline, "Man Kidnaps 5 Santas for Christmas Education," captured the bizarre nature of the incident, but failed to convey the complex mixture of mental illness, family pressure, and genuine concern for children's welfare that had driven Frank's actions. During his psychological evaluation, Frank remained convinced that his actions had been necessary and justified. He expressed no remorse for the kidnappings, but showed genuine concern about whether the Santa performers had learned enough from their training to improve their future interactions with children. "I'm not sorry I did it," Frank told court-appointed psychiatrists. "Those children deserved better than they were getting. Someone had to take a stand for Christmas justice, and if that meant extraordinary measures, then so be it." Margaret and the 3 Castellano children found themselves thrust into a media circus that transformed their Christmas celebration into a nightmare of public scrutiny and family shame. The house on 47th Avenue was surrounded by reporters and curious neighbors, forcing the family to spend the holiday with relatives, while lawyers and social workers determined the best course forward. How could this happen? Margaret asked herself repeatedly during the long nights, when she tried to make sense of how her husband's love for his children and desire to provide them with perfect Christmas memories had spiraled into such destructive obsession. How did we get from wanting a magical Christmas to this? The legal proceedings that followed Frank's arrest revealed the complex intersection of mental illness, economic pressure, and social isolation that had contributed to his breakdown. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of financial stress during holiday seasons, the way normal parental protective instincts could become distorted under pressure, and the dangerous potential of obsessive thinking patterns that were allowed to develop without intervention. Frank was ultimately sentenced to 18 months in a psychiatric facility, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The kidnapped Santa performers, while physically unharmed, required extensive therapy to process their bizarre ordeal and return to normal holiday performance work. The Castellano family never fully recovered from the events of December 1987. Margaret filed for divorce the following year, unable to reconcile her love for Frank with her fear of his capacity for obsessive behavior. Tommy, Lisa, and Michael each processed their father's breakdown in different ways. Tommy with anger and rebellion, Lisa with anxious perfectionism, and Michael with a lasting distrust of authority figures and holiday traditions. Years later, investigators and mental health professionals would study Frank's case as an example of how holiday stress, economic pressure, and untreated mental illness could combine to create dangerous situations that destroyed families and traumatized communities. His detailed documentation of perceived Santa-based injustices became part of academic literature about obsessive thinking patterns and the psychology of vigilante behavior. The warehouse where Frank conducted his Christmas Rehabilitation Center was eventually converted into a legitimate community center, though neighborhood residents continued to refer to it as the Santa Place for decades afterward. The story became part of New York City's collection of bizarre holiday incidents, told and retold during subsequent Christmas seasons as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining perspective during the emotionally charged holiday period. Margaret Castellano, who resumed her maiden name after the divorce, spent years in therapy trying to understand how she had missed the warning signs of her husband's deteriorating mental state. She became an advocate for mental health awareness and holiday stress management, speaking to community groups about the importance of seeking help before family pressures escalated into dangerous territory. "I thought I was married to a man who loved his children and wanted to give them perfect Christmas memories," she would tell audiences during her awareness presentations. "I didn't realize that his love had become an obsession, and his desire to protect them had become a danger to everyone around us. The signs were there, but I didn't know how to recognize them or what to do about them." The 5 kidnapped Santa performers eventually returned to holiday work, though several required extensive therapy and career counseling before they could resume their Christmas season employment. Their experience highlighted the psychological vulnerability of seasonal workers, who often dealt with difficult customers, long hours, and the pressure to maintain cheerful personas regardless of personal circumstances. One of the kidnapped Santas, the Times Square street performer who had been Frank's first target, eventually became an advocate for better working conditions and mental health support for holiday performers. "We're out there trying to bring joy to children and families," he told a congressional hearing on workplace safety for seasonal employees. "But we're also human beings with our own stress and problems. When someone like Frank Castellano comes along, convinced that we're failing in our duties, it's a reminder that we need better support systems and clearer guidelines about how to handle difficult situations." Frank himself, after completing his psychiatric treatment and probation period, moved to a small town in upstate New York, where he worked as a carpenter and lived quietly under an assumed name. He rarely spoke about the events of December 1987, but neighbors occasionally noticed that he avoided shopping centers and public spaces during the Christmas season, preferring to spend the holidays alone with books and woodworking projects. In his rare moments of reflection about his actions, Frank maintained that his intentions had been pure, even if his methods had been wrong. "Those children deserved better," he would say when directly asked about his motivations. "I still believe that. I went about it the wrong way. I lost perspective about what was reasonable and what was necessary." The Christmas of 1987 had begun with Frank Castellano's sincere desire to create perfect holiday memories for his children. It ended with a family destroyed, a community traumatized, and 5 innocent Santa performers forever changed by their encounter with a man whose love had been twisted into something dangerous and obsessive. The story serves as a reminder that the holiday season, with its emphasis on perfection, generosity, and family happiness, can create pressures that push vulnerable individuals beyond their capacity to cope. Frank's quest for Christmas justice had started with legitimate concerns about fairness and respect for children, but his inability to maintain perspective and seek appropriate help had transformed those concerns into a destructive force that harmed everyone it touched. Years later, as New York City continued its annual cycle of Christmas celebrations, the story of Frank Castellano and his kidnapped Santas remained a cautionary tale about the thin line between protective love and dangerous obsession, and the importance of recognizing when holiday stress had moved beyond normal family challenges into territory that required professional intervention before tragedy could unfold. The true cost of Frank's Christmas Justice campaign couldn't be measured in legal penalties or media coverage, but in the lasting trauma inflicted on innocent people and the permanent destruction of a family that had simply wanted to share the magic of Christmas with their children. It was a price that continued to be paid long after the headlines faded and the holiday decorations were packed away, a reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers to families come not from external threats, but from the distortion of the very love that was meant to protect them.